West Alaxia is not the wealthiest region in the world, though neither is it the poorest. Jimarian political theorist Nar Serent considered the region to consist of what he dubbed middling powers. Unable to rival the powers of Ceironia, Suta, Fazar, or the High Kingdoms economically, but still able to hold the influence of many poorer nations of the world, such as those of northern and western Kadesh. Of course, it has not always been this way. Throughout the 2300s and into the early 2400s, the region was ruled primarily by outside colonial empires. In the later half of the 24th century, the Fazarian and Azerian empires sought to expand their power and influence over Western Alaxia. By 2400, Thraxia, Avathraxia, Urbaxia, Tuzal, and Yaintai were under Fazarian rule. Ginsukiu was under Azieri, and most of Atlantia was under the thumb of the Ruskvi. In the early years of the Great War, Lothuan capitulated to Fazar and Azieri, leading to the formation of the Dominion of Jimaria in 2410, which joined Avathraxia and Urbaxia with territories formerly under Lotharian rule. And with pressure from independence movements, Fazar and Azieri agreed to the formation of the semi-independent Second Dulian Union in 2412, combining Thrax, Ginsukiu, and eventually Atlantia, once it was liberated from the Ruskvi during the war. In 2439, after defeating a Ginsukian insurgency that lasted over 20 years, the Iulians demanded Fazar cede Tuzal, Yaintai, the North Atlantic islands, Avathraxia, and Pelagros to the Union. Fazar did not take kindly to these demands, nor several other perceived violations of the initial terms of Iulian independence, and soon launched an invasion of Iulia, supported by Azieri. In 2441, Iulia surrendered and was subsumed back fully under Fazarian rule, as a state of the newly formed Imperial Combine, which would soon grow to encompass Azieri as well. The Combine would prove short-lived though, and in 2448, the Imperial Congress would move to dissolve the Combine, leading to the independence of West Alaxian nations. Initially, the relations between Fazar and its former imperial holdings were close, with a shared currency and the Fazarian Empress remaining as mostly a powerless figurehead for all the new countries. However, it would not take long for even these connections to disappear, as first Jimaria and then the other West Alaxian nations ceased to recognize titles of nobility, and within 10 years, had all adopt their own local currencies. Our main story truly begins on the great island of Ceironia, the 8th of June in the year 2475. Marshal of Justice Mikhail Zaistev is elected as the new Grand Marshal, after Georgy Tarasov's 41-year rule over Ceironia. Zaistev sought to distance the nation from Tarasov's regime, renaming the country from Ceironian State to the Rioxin Republic, moving the capital, adopting a new flag, and organizing the island under a federal government of 56 states. By November, trials of the previous government were underway, due to their involvement in the 2474 Croatian nuclear exchange. Many, including Tarasov, were convicted of treason and sentenced to life in prison. By 2476, however, Zaistev's eyes had begun to turn east, towards Alaxia. In November of that year, the nations of Thrax, Ginsukiu, Atlantia, Karkus, and Runkuk all withdrew from the Fazarian-led Democratic Mid-Sea Organization to join the Rioxin-led Global Economic and Defense Union. This mass departure was tied to largely Thraxian-stoked fears that Fazar was planning to reassert domination over its former colonies, and possibly re-establish the Imperial Combine. Almost as soon as the nations had formally entered the Rioxis Pact, Zaistev began deploying soldiers to their territory to bolster their defenses. This deployment worried Jimarian President Arhok Ulgrim, as Thraxia always claimed rightful ownership of Avathraxia, despite almost no support coming from the Avathraxian population to unite with their cousins in the west. In response, Ulgrim ordered the deployment of 10 Jimarian army regiments to stand permanent guard along the Thraxian and Ginsukian borders. Throughout 2477, 78, and 79, global tensions had continued to rise. Rioxia escalated their ongoing Cold War against Sutan, and civil wars had erupted in Eboi, the CCR, and Sakibusi. Under this climate, Zaistev deployed another of 100,000 Rioxin soldiers, supported by thousands of armored vehicles and hundreds of aircraft into various parts of Thrax. Ogrim responded by deploying over 140,000 Jimarian soldiers to the border, to which Rioxin sent 100,000 more. And Ogrim deployed another 60,000, with Prime Minister Basal Rusfo of Fazar authorizing 200,000 Fazarian soldiers to move to Jimaria and to Zal. At the end of October, however, something very interesting happened. Rioxin forces, at the order of Zaistev, began a coup against the Thraxian government. In November, Fazarian forces moved to support the Rioxins in their invasion, primarily through air support, and Jimarian forces sought to establish military occupation over all of Thrax within 60 kilometers of the Jimarian border. This Rioxin betrayal was not as sudden as it seemed, with historians now understanding that Zaistev and Rusfo had signed a secret agreement a couple years earlier to cooperate in the overthrowing of the Thraxian government. This was in order to secure their influence and prevent Suton from gaining any sway in the region. In Rioxin, this perceived act of treachery against an ally was perceived very poorly, to say nothing of the international community's reaction to a seemingly random war of aggression. In response, the Rioxin government announced that it believed the Thraxian government was developing weapons of mass destruction, in a violation of a number of treaties, and had to be stopped before they could make a use of such weapons. The Fazarian government quickly moved to support these claims. The claims were enough to get International Concord to vote against the Thraxian proposal to sanction Rioxin and Fazar for the invasion, with approximately 61% of voting members denying the motion, though it should be noted almost a third of the body abstained. By the end of December, the Thraxian capital of New Denmark had fallen. By the end of February 2480, New Farbanti, Tongberg, Ulwerp, and Dubenboen had fallen to the Rioxin occupation. March saw the first Thraxian victory in the war, with the city of Bischofdal resisting the invaders. But it was soon overshadowed by the joint Rioxin-Jimarian occupation of Winsingen and the Rioxin occupation of Schafsoe. May 2480 saw the arrival of investigators from the international city in Lunador seeking to determine the validity of the weapons of mass destruction claims, alongside 10,000 Lunadorian soldiers. By the end of June, most of Thraxia was under Rioxin military occupation, and the International Concord had approved for a multinational team of investigators to begin looking into the weapons of mass destruction claims. In August, a joint force of Thraxian guerrilla fighters and the Thraxian army liberated New Denmark, while the Lunadorian military began to establish an occupation zone in southern Thrax, under a pretense of headquartering their investigation and protecting Lunadorian nationals in Thrax. By the end of 2480, the Thraxian government was presenting evidence that the Rioxin government never actually believed Thrax possessed or was developing weapons of mass destruction, even getting support for some anti-war politicians in the Rioxin government. In Rioxin itself, High Marshal Zaistev was undertaking increasingly authoritarian measures to clamp down on the anti-war protest which was sweeping the country, including the alleged assassination of Governor Douglas T. Nimrod. Going into 2481, the Jimarian government was allegedly conducting a series of covert missions to eliminate Thraxian paramilitary leaders. The Jimarian government denies these claims to this day. By February, the war's last major battle was waged, as Thraxian forces liberated the strategic port of Zwingen-Molsen. From there, fighting died down mostly to skirmishes and air raids. In June, all of the 3 investigations released their reports. The international city investigators determined Thrax had no weapons of mass destruction program, though there were some accusations of bribery to call this into question. The Lunadorian investigators published a much less thorough report also determining no weapons of mass destruction had been developed. The International Concord Coalition investigators found some evidence of biochemical weapons in Thrax, but could not determine if they were from Thraxian or Rioxin origin. In July, the International Concord determined almost unanimously that the Rioxin invasion had been unjust, and threatened to levy sanctions against Rioxin and Fazar if their forces did not withdraw by the end of the month. Pressure from both at home and abroad sought the withdrawal begin within days of the IC's decision. Even with the war more or less over, the crisis in Rioxin continued on, until September 21st, 2482, the government was overthrown and the Ceironian Union was established. Alexei Grigorovich was elected the new High Marshal just a few days later, pledging for a more open and democratic Ceironia. The Fazarian government would also be deposed, but far more peacefully in a snap election in December 2482. Jimarian forces would withdraw in December 2482, once the Thraxian government was deemed to have re-established the rule of law over its territory. Unlike Ceironia and Fazar, the Jimarian government actually maintained popularity after the war, as most saw the occupation of the border region as necessary to ensure conflict could not stray into Jimarian soil. Indeed, President Ogrim would serve the maximum of 4 terms allowed under Jimarian law, being re-elected in 2480, 2485, and 2490. Lunadar would not withdraw its small occupation until July 2483, after their forces had spent over a month encircled by a blockade. Thrax would technically claim victory in the war, though at a great cost, with most historians labeling the war a strategic defeat. The Fazarian strategic bombing campaign, coupled with years of urban fighting, left many Thraxian cities little more than ruins. Just over 1 million Thraxians had lost their lives, almost 1% of the country's total population at the time, and the nation's economy was devastated.